On March 13, a cascade of unprecedented diplomatic events unfolded that left the world in a state of disbelief as former U.S. President Donald Trump delivered an ultimatum to Russian President Vladimir Putin in a manner that was as bold as it was unexpected, sending ripples through the corridors of global power and leaving a trail of anxious whispers among international leaders. In a secret meeting held in a secluded and heavily guarded facility just outside Washington, D.C., Trump, whose reputation for unfiltered and dramatic rhetoric had only grown in the years following his presidency, convened with a small group of high-ranking former officials, intelligence experts, and trusted advisors. The meeting was convened under the most confidential circumstances, with every participant aware that the implications of what was about to be discussed could irrevocably alter the course of international relations. Trump, exuding a confidence that bordered on defiance, began by asserting that the United States could no longer tolerate what he described as a series of provocative actions and covert operations orchestrated by Moscow, ranging from cyber attacks that had disrupted critical infrastructure to economic maneuvers that undermined the delicate balance of power in global markets. Without any hint of hesitation, he declared that the time had come for Russia to change its course or face consequences that would reshape the international order in ways that were both unpredictable and potentially catastrophic. The atmosphere inside the secure conference room was thick with tension as every word from Trump's lips was met with a mixture of shock, skepticism, and a growing sense of inevitability. Although the meeting was held behind closed doors, the details of his ultimatum quickly began to leak out, fueling a media frenzy that transformed the narrative from one of cautious diplomacy to a full-blown international incident. As the hours passed and the story began to take on a life of its own, intelligence agencies and political strategists around the globe found themselves scrambling to assess the true meaning behind Trump's remarks. Many saw the ultimatum as a dramatic but necessary intervention, a clarion call to hold Moscow accountable for actions that had long been ignored by the international community, while others warned that it might merely be a provocative gesture designed to distract from domestic issues or to reassert Trump's relevance on the world stage. Meanwhile, inside the Kremlin, President Vladimir Putin and his inner circle were engaged in intense discussions, weighing their options in response to this unprecedented move. While publicly maintaining a calm and measured demeanor, behind closed doors, senior advisors debated whether to confront the challenge head-on with an equally forceful response or to seek a path of diplomatic de-escalation that could avert a potential crisis. In a series of rapid-fire meetings and confidential briefings, Putin's administration grappled with the stark reality that this ultimatum could either be a turning point toward a more accountable era in international relations or the spark that ignited a dangerous spiral into open conflict. The tension in Moscow was palpable, as every decision made in the coming hours was understood to have far-reaching consequences not only for Russia but for the entire world. As news of the ultimatum spread beyond the confines of the secret meeting, international media outlets picked up on the story with fervor, their headlines echoing the sentiment that history was being made on March 13. Analysts on cable news and in printed editorials dissected every word of Trump's statement, debating whether his rhetoric was the result of a calculated maneuver to reassert American strength or the reckless bravado of a leader unwilling to accept the constraints of traditional diplomacy. Social media platforms exploded with speculation as ordinary citizens, political pundits, and conspiracy theorists alike offered their interpretations of the unfolding events, each adding layers of meaning to a narrative that was already complex and multifaceted. In one continuous, unyielding stream of communication, messages from all corners of the globe debated the merits of Trump's ultimatum, with some hailing it as the bold step necessary to force a re-evaluation of Russia's international conduct, while others decried it as a reckless gamble that risked destabilizing an already fragile geopolitical balance. Even as the world watched with bated breath, diplomatic back channels buzzed with activity. Emissaries from nations long accustomed to playing the role of mediators in high-stakes international disputes reached out to both Washington and Moscow in an attempt to establish communication lines that might prevent an inadvertent slide into open conflict. In quiet, secretive negotiations held in neutral locations, proposals were drafted, redrafted, and whispered into existence by seasoned diplomats who understood that the stakes of the moment could not be overstated. For many of these mediators, the goal was not to assign blame or to score political points, but rather to steer the situation away from the precipice of escalation and toward a pathway that might lead to a durable resolution, one that acknowledged the grievances on both sides without sacrificing the stability of the international order. Yet even as these delicate negotiations unfolded behind closed doors, the public narrative continued to swell, its tone oscillating between outrage and cautious optimism. In Washington, current administration officials and military strategists found themselves forced to contend with the fallout of Trump's statement, issuing carefully worded statements that reassured the American public of the nation's commitment to global stability while simultaneously warning that any missteps could have dire consequences. At the same time, leaders in allied nations expressed both solidarity and concern, their diplomatic cables filled with urgent pleas for calm and reminders that the repercussions of a miscalculated response could extend far beyond the borders of any single nation. The international financial markets, ever sensitive to geopolitical shocks, reacted with a volatility that underscored the gravity of the situation. Stocks fluctuated wildly and investors braced for the impact of a potential conflict that, although not yet fully realized, loomed large on the horizon. Across Europe and Asia, military installations heightened their alert status as a precautionary measure, a testament to the widespread recognition that the world had entered a period of uncertainty where even the smallest spark could set off a conflagration of unprecedented proportions. Amid this maelstrom of uncertainty and high-stakes diplomacy, Trump's ultimatum remained a potent symbol of a moment when traditional modes of international engagement were challenged by a leader unafraid to disrupt the status quo. His language, unfiltered and unapologetic, was a stark departure from the carefully measured tones typically employed by state actors, a reminder that in the volatile realm of international politics, the lines between negotiation and confrontation can blur in the blink of an eye. As hours turned into days and the full implications of the ultimatum began to be digested by an anxious world, the narrative continued to evolve. Private conversations among diplomats and military officials revealed that there was a growing consensus on both sides of the Atlantic. While the rhetoric of the ultimatum might have been incendiary, it was also a reflection of deep-seated frustrations and long-ignored grievances that had accumulated over years of contentious interactions. In Russia, a faction within Putin's inner circle advocated for a measured response that emphasized the need for dialogue and compromise, even as more hawkish voices warned that any show of weakness could be exploited by adversaries. In Washington, similar debates raged over whether to engage in further provocative rhetoric or to adopt a more conciliatory stance in hopes of avoiding an uncontrollable escalation. Despite these divergent opinions, one thing was clear: the world had reached a tipping point, and the decisions made in the coming days would determine the trajectory of international relations for years to come. As the saga unfolded, countless individuals, ranging from high-ranking officials to ordinary citizens, were left to grapple with the unsettling realization that the rules of global engagement were shifting beneath their feet. In living rooms, cafes, and offices around the world, people discussed the events of March 13 in hushed tones, uncertain about what the future held but united in the hope that cooler heads would prevail. In a world that had long prided itself on the stability of established alliances and the predictability of international law, the ultimatum served as a jarring reminder that power dynamics were in constant flux, and that the actions of a single individual, no matter how polarizing, could set off a chain reaction with consequences that reached far beyond the confines of traditional diplomacy. Even as the world waited with bated breath for a definitive response from Moscow, there was an undercurrent of optimism among those who believed that this moment of crisis could ultimately lead to a renewed commitment to accountability and reform, a chance to confront long-standing issues with a clarity that had been elusive in previous decades. The days that followed were marked by an almost palpable tension, as the international community braced itself for what might come next. In a series of rapid and discreet consultations, diplomats worked around the clock to chart a course that would neither embolden aggressive posturing nor allow for reckless escalation. The pressure to act was immense, with every participant in the unfolding drama acutely aware that the fate of nations might well hang in the balance. As night fell over the capitals of the world, the weight of the ultimatum settled heavily on the shoulders of both Washington and Moscow, a constant reminder that in the realm of international relations, the difference between peace and conflict can be as thin as the line between words and actions. In the end, the events of March 13 were destined to become a seminal chapter in the annals of modern history, a moment when the audacity of one leader challenged the established norms of diplomacy and forced the world to reckon with the volatile interplay of power, pride, and the unyielding quest for accountability. Though the immediate future remained shrouded in uncertainty, there was a growing recognition that the legacy of that day would extend far beyond the confines of any single meeting or declaration. It was a reminder that in an interconnected world, even the most dramatic of ultimatums can serve as both a catalyst for change and a stark warning of the perils that lie in wait when nations fail to find common ground. As the global community continued to navigate the treacherous waters of high-stakes diplomacy, the story of March 13, and the fateful ultimatum delivered by Trump, would be remembered not merely as a moment of crisis, but as a turning point that compelled leaders and citizens alike to confront the realities of a rapidly evolving world where the future could be reshaped by the power of a single, unyielding declaration. On March 13, the international stage was set for a dramatic turning point that few could have anticipated, and as the reverberations of the ultimatum continued to ripple across continents, the world found itself teetering on the brink of an uncertain future. In a relentless, unyielding stream of diplomatic negotiations and covert communications, both Washington and Moscow engaged in a high-stakes dance that left little room for error or retreat. Amid mounting pressure from allies and adversaries alike, a cadre of experienced diplomats and military strategists worked tirelessly to forge a path toward de-escalation, even as the echoes of Trump's stark declaration reverberated through every corridor of power. Behind closed doors, in secure facilities shrouded in secrecy, urgent meetings took place where the potential consequences of an unchecked confrontation were laid bare, and every word was weighed against the possibility of igniting a conflict that could spiral into chaos. The air was thick with tension and uncertainty, as advisors deliberated over the merits of bold action versus cautious restraint, all while the clock ticked relentlessly toward an unknown destiny. Even as public sentiment swelled with both hope and fear, the voices of reason within the international community emphasized the critical need for dialogue and measured responses, warning that any misstep could precipitate a chain reaction with dire implications for global stability. The financial markets, sensitive to the slightest hint of instability, reacted with rapid fluctuations, and ordinary citizens around the world watched with a mix of apprehension and resolve, uncertain whether the ultimatum would serve as a catalyst for lasting reform or merely exacerbate deep-seated divisions. In Moscow, President Putin and his closest advisors convened in an atmosphere of restrained urgency, grappling with the dual imperatives of asserting national pride and preventing a descent into full-scale confrontation. Their deliberations, conducted in hushed tones and punctuated by strategic pauses, reflected an acute awareness of the high stakes involved. Any decision made in those critical hours could alter the course of history. Simultaneously, back channels opened between neutral intermediaries and representatives from both superpowers, as the world's mediators sought to bridge the widening gap between provocative rhetoric and the necessity for calm, measured diplomacy. These discreet negotiations, though largely hidden from the public eye, were instrumental in crafting contingency plans that aimed to defuse the escalating tension without compromising the principle of accountability. As the day unfolded and the narrative of that fateful March afternoon grew increasingly complex, it became evident that the ultimatum was more than just a singular moment of confrontation. It was a profound symbol of a changing geopolitical landscape, one in which traditional alliances and long-standing norms were being rigorously re-examined. The resolve of global leaders was being tested in real time, and the path forward remained fraught with ambiguity, challenging both the boldness of past actions and the promise of a more balanced, dialogue-driven future. In the final analysis, as the world braced for whatever outcomes might follow, the events of March 13 would be remembered not simply for the shockwaves they sent through the corridors of power, but for the enduring lesson they imparted, that in an era of rapid change and interconnected destinies, even the most audacious declarations must ultimately yield to the imperative of measured, constructive engagement.